Good morning, everybody. And it's a very happy, sunny Thursday, so we welcome you here to the Wilson Center. I'm Gwen Young, the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project here at the Wilson Center. And for those of you who don't know us, we have a very simple goal of ensuring that by 2050, women hold 50% of leadership positions worldwide. And this is important for what we're talking about today because it's policies that are within companies and within governments that are going to allow women to have the same access to opportunity, the same career paths, the same access to healthcare as their male counterparts and rise up into leadership positions. And today what we're going to talk about is the policies that are going to help make this happen, us achieve our goals, and develop what EMD Serono calls healthy women, healthy economies. Our event today is entitled Balancing the Burden of Care, the Impact of Policies on Productivity. We are honored to have our partnership with EMD Serono and our distinguished panel here to talk today about the impact on health-related quality of life that the burden of care poses. And the burden of care involves the physical, emotional, social, and financial cost of caring not just for children, but for other family members within your household and within your community. So to start today, I would like to introduce you to Belen Gariju. Belen is a member of the executive board and CEO healthcare of Merck KJAA Darmstadt, Germany, which operates as EMD Serono here in the United States and Canada. Belen, we are honored. I'd like to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be part of this distinguished group and very, very pleased of the choice of the venue given the topic. I'm sure I'm not discovering anything new if I say President Wilson was a champion of women's rights and was instrumental in the process of giving American women the right to vote. And the 19th Amendment became law during his administration. Most importantly, he referred to this later as a great honor and one of the greatest honors of his life. But almost 98 years later, the effort continues. And we wonder every day whether we are making sufficient progress. And, in brief, I believe we need to do better. And yes, we need to debate. We need to use each and every occasion to debate. But most importantly, we need to take our decisions into action, which is the most important thing. And this is the philosophy and the principles that have guided our efforts within our company. So at Merck KGaA Darmstadt, Germany, which is the legal name we have to use in the US to name EMD Serono, we have actually taken a very hard look at the how and what we are doing with regards to bringing women to leadership positions faster, ensuring pay equity, and as a consequence, strive to achieve one day gender equality. So even though we are above the average, and I can share a bit some of the figures later on during the panel, we are above average in terms of women in senior leadership positions. We are not where I would think we should be, and we are very, very determined to make progress. We have very recently set up a global task force that has been working over the last 6 months to better understand what is preventing women to reach to the top, to help us go from the symptoms to really the root causes to be able to make progress that is also sustainable. And these guys have been interviewing different people, senior leaders, holding focus groups, and they come back to the executive committee that I chaired with several concrete proposals. We are going to start by establishing very clear objectives for our leaders and our organization, but we are also going to educate our people on certain topics. So we are training our senior leaders today on unconscious bias, which is one of the hurdles that we definitely identified. And we are working very closely with the task force to address some of the strategic topics, including, mentoring, sponsorship, and most importantly, for females, flexible working schedules. And I can tell you that the impact of this will not be felt overnight. It's going to take it's going to take time, it's going to take efforts, it's going to take very strong determination and a lot of top-down sponsorship. We are putting this in the frame of the data that we have identified, and we start from the view that we need to do more. We don't need to build a very solid business case because obviously this is a common sense topic, and we believe that diversity and inclusion is actually key to succeed in today's economy. Let me use some of the figures that actually raised concerns and sent a kind of wake-up call to all of us. I'm sure you are familiar with these figures because some of those were very recently published. If I say 217 years, I'm sure you would recognize that this is coming from the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, and it refers to the number of years that it will take until women have equal pay and representation in the workplace. 217 years. If I say 865 million, this is another key figure, and is the one coming from the International Labour Organization that has calculated that as many as 865 million of our mothers, daughters, sisters across the globe are not reaching their full potential to contribute to the national economies, due to preventable causes. And that is affecting all of us in the end, regardless of gender. So what are some of the hurdles that we have identified as those holding women back from achieving their full potential? For example, depending upon where one lives and the social norms, the initial diagnosis and the treatment options and the clinical outcomes related to health topics frequently favor men. And when health costs rise, households may not tighten the belt as much for men as for women. And as a provider for solutions for diseases that affect women disproportionately, as multiple sclerosis, thyroid diseases, etc., we have quite a lot of experience understanding how to improve health and well-being of women. And we also understand that a healthy society requires much more than medicines. So we are investing efforts and resources, hoping to improve the health outcome of women all around the world, from awareness to education, access to healthcare, and we are advocating for policies that can enhance productivity and, most importantly, advance equity. We see the bigger picture of how health and prosperity are intertwined for women, and obviously, as a private sector dedicated to healthcare, we are very committed to address the challenges. But we cannot do this alone. We knew that when we started what we call Healthy Women, Healthy Economies, which is a public-private initiative that was formed with the backing of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation in 2014, with the government of the United States very actively participating on this initiative. And as the founding private sector of Healthy Women, Healthy Economies, we have advanced quite a lot working with partners to developing actionable toolkits and providing platforms for governments and other stakeholders to advance on their own constraints and challenges. So the Healthy Women, Healthy Economies initiative, which is making us extremely proud and that we can discuss also later during the debate, is looking at traditional health care access barriers, as well as broader topics such as the impact of unpaid work, and correlating those issues with economic impact and success in the workplace. So we understand this is benefiting already some countries, but we wanted to also incorporate this into our own company, and we ran an internal diagnosis that now triggered a concrete action plan to help our women employees to thrive in the workplace and to achieve their career aspirations. We are a family-owned company. We have been in business for 350 years. We are celebrating our 350 years anniversary this year. And obviously, caring for families and patients is really very close to us and is part of our DNA. In the US, we are also focused on caregiving because the act of caregiving has unique impacts on women in terms of economic, emotional, and physical well-being. And according to a survey recently conducted by our company, on behalf of our company, 25% of female unpaid caregivers spend 5 to 9 hours in an average week of their caregiving duties. So to help bring awareness to this crucial role of unpaid caregivers, we launched another global initiative which is very closely related to Healthy Women, Healthy Economies, called Embracing Carers. And some of my team is championing this initiative are here today. And with those two initiatives, we are actively engaging in quantifying the impact of the role of caregiving and advocating for progress on behalf of those filling these rewarding and challenging roles. I'm thrilled that one of our key partners, the National Alliance for Caregiving, is represented here today. So thank you very much, Grace, to Grace Whiting, who will speak about some of the things we are working on together. Thank you for joining us. And also very pleased to have Stacey Stewart from March of Dimes here. Today we announced a new collaboration with the March of Dimes to promote the health of expecting and new mothers and their babies. And we couldn't be more thrilled to engage into this collaboration to raise awareness, but eventually to discuss policies that will have the potential to reduce the burden of care equally and shape women's health, empower them economically, and in doing so, something that we are convinced we can do is that we will improve performance. And this is definitely quantified by many. So as we continue to progress, we cannot underestimate the role that men play in all this to help us to achieve gender parity. And Gary Barker from Promundo has dedicated his career to engaging boys and men in the movement for gender parity, which is why I'm so glad to meet him here today and that he's here with us today. So to conclude, I would like to thank you all for your attention and for joining us today to discuss the impact of policies that could help us deal with these challenges that I have mentioned before faster and in a more effective way. I look forward to a very productive discussion later on with the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Belen. And now I'd like to call to the stage Gary Barker, the CEO of Promundo, Stacey Stewart, who is, sorry, I always want to get the right title, so I apologize. You do have everyone's bios in your packet, but she is the president of the March of Dimes, and Grace Whiting is the president and CEO of the National Alliance for Caregiving. I'd like to invite you to the stage. And thank you, Belen, for these great comments that I think really set the stage for why we have who we have here on stage. All of this built around partnership and the different roles people are playing in caregiving. Also, you mentioned something about EMD Serono with sort of ideas and action. So we've got the role of advocacy as well as sort of what's happening here in the United States globally, which I think is really important. And before I turn over the questions, a couple of statistics for the United States to just sort of set the stage a little bit about what we're talking about. We've got, 64.2% of women with children are in the workforce, right? And 58% of those women in the workforce have children under one. And the stats that we're collecting today often, and we have a data project at the project I work with, focus on people with kids. They don't often capture people that have obligations at home or with family members for other reasons. But I wanted to just set the stage of those stats. It's sort of, as you were saying, Belen, people have hours outside of work that they have to go home and take care of people. So I do want to turn it over to you, Belen, to sort of start off with the question of how do policies, these policies around caregiving impact men and women, during their prime economic years, right? And can you talk a little bit more in detail about sort of who bears the burden, what this looks like?
Yes, thank you for the question. Look, I believe that from our private sector perspective, it is important that all the policies that we put in place are, targeting men and women. And what I found most important is not only the policies, right, but most importantly that we develop this culture that will embrace topics like diversity and inclusion, right? And to do that, we have been quite focused on leadership capabilities and how do we measure the performance of our teams on the basis of certain indicators that are very, very important to the culture that we want to create. And, we do from the day-to-day, the bread and butter of education and encouragement of, for example, male taking parental leave, which is actually still a challenge in many countries.
Yep.
And it's not only from time to time something that is not naturally happening, but also that is putting that reputation at risk, right? It's questioned by the society, and this is not only in the Southern European countries, but also in a country like Germany, for example, right? So we do a lot of this in our company, and we try to establish and copy best practices of others, so we don't reinvent the wheel and go faster. And, something that I found quite important to continue to help women and other population like caregivers in the company to continue to fully integrate their personal objective and their career objectives is to have flexible working environments. So to be honest, we have stopped relocating people. This is, or relocating everybody that will take an international assignment. This is much more efficient, and this is actually giving access to many women to positions that they will never be able to accept if they have to relocate from Europe to the United States, or vice versa.
Absolutely.
So it's all this that is helping us progress in this front.
Wonderful. That's Grace. I want to turn it over to you quickly to talk about. You've talked about diversity and inclusion. Who are these women? What is, I was at the Commission on the Status on Women earlier this week saying women are not one homogenous group. So perhaps Grace and Stacey, sort of who are these women that we're looking at, and what are you talked about sort of the flexible time of work, and there's also issues of full and part-time work. Grace, I'd love to get your thoughts, and Stacey, yours as well, I think.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, from our perspective, caregiving is an issue that affects people of all different backgrounds, men and women. And that when we talk about caregiving, we're really talking about caring across the lifespan. So when you're caring for someone because they're ill or because they have a disability, when we've done our research, nationally representative research with AARP, we found that about 60% of caregivers for someone who's ill or who has a disability are women, and that your typical caregiver is usually a 49-year-old woman caring for an older relative because of a long-term health condition or need. And that's sort of what we think of when we think of caregiving. But that said, I think it's important to note that our conception of gender roles is changing. And when you break down America's caregivers by cohort, you can see in that 18 to 34 group, men and women are equally as likely to be caregivers. And I think it speaks to this momentum we're seeing about the way men think about family and the way we think as a society about caring for someone, whether that should be gendered work or whether that's something that we're just all in it together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just add to this that at the March Dimes, our primary objective is to focus on the health of moms and babies, and in our work, we have a primary focus on looking at the issue of premature birth, which is the leading cause of death. Premature birth and its complications is the leading cause of death for children between the ages of 0 and 5. So we're looking at that as a primary issue, but we're looking at the issue of healthy moms and healthy babies generally. And one of the things that happens, and just to be specific about the U.S., is that our government really provides, very little support or incentives to address the needs that families have, especially if the family has this burden of a baby that's born too sick and too soon. So often what happens to a family where that happens, a baby may have to be in the neonatal intensive care unit for days, weeks, sometimes months. The financial burden on that family is tremendous. It's often the woman who bears the burden of caregiving during that time. She may have to discontinue work, which then exacerbates the financial burden. We know, though, that without the help of Medicaid for many of these families would and we've been told this by some of the families that we touch in our work, that they would be faced with bankruptcy were it not for the support from Medicaid. So that's one of the reasons we've been such a strong advocate for protecting Medicaid for families where babies are born with tremendous challenges. But beyond that, I think one of the things that we see is that industry actually is more progressive in some of these areas than even our own government. You see a lot of companies that offer a lot more workplace flexibilities that even our government doesn't incentivize. We do know that there are at the state level, not the federal level, beginning to see some changes. We've got at least 4 states that are offering paid family leave, which I think is very exciting to see how that will play out and give families a little bit more support and financial support, and especially if they have special needs. And the last thing I'll just say about this is that I think, and you mentioned the point around diversity and inclusion, and you did too, Belen. We know that in this country and around the world, especially in this country, we have tremendous health disparities. So the issue of premature birth affects women of color many more times over that as compared to other women. African American women are 50% more likely to have a baby born too sick and too soon. Women of color generally have babies that are born premature. That means that those babies will then have special needs. That means those families then have special financial burdens. So, and many of those families are the families least able to bear those kinds of financial burdens. And so one of the things that we're very concerned about in this is that we make sure that all women and all families have the supports that they need, but we know that that in some communities, those supports are even more important than they are in other communities.
Absolutely. Gary, I want to bring you in on this sort of increasing role of men and men sort of, on the one hand, as Grace was saying, sort of shouldering this burden and sort of the mid-career part is what I think is what you're saying as well. And I do think that there's this increasing one. I want to hear more about that and what does that look like. On the flip side, some of these policies within companies, they'll say we institute family leave and still it's 98% of the women that take it. Can you tell us what that looks like? Can you explain all of that to us?
I mean, I think even I'm not going to be the man whisperer of why aren't men taking leave, but we do know a lot of the reasons of why men aren't taking leave. So even, the only countries I think that have had an imagination to say men could do half the care work are mostly our Scandinavian countries. In terms of putting parental leave policies that say equal days for fathers as for mothers, non-transferable, and making it paid. I mean, we know that's got to be part of
the non-transferable piece, I think, is key, right?
Piece. So, whether it's the Iceland model, 5 months for fathers, 5 months for mothers, and 2 months they can share, but the assumption that if the father doesn't use that 5 months, they can't pass that to mothers, because we know what that looks like. Mothers tend to take it. One is the issue of we talked about unconscious bias, we still have a very unconscious bias that men are providers, and that we're bumbling, not very capable, we can walk away from caregiving, we don't do the psychological burden of the caregiving. There's a lot of assumptions that we as men won't do it. Those assumptions live in men's heads, they live in women's heads, they live in employers' heads of, if he takes time off, just how serious of a worker is he? So men do worry, if I walk away from it, if I take some time off, will I be seen as that worker who's going to climb in his career? As long as men's incomes continue to be that 20 to 22% higher than women's, families faced with the decision will say, well, she'll take the time off and he'll stay in the workplace. So I think the shift has got to be policy. It's got to be changing norms about it. The having this, and you talked about there is a younger generation starting to get it, but I think we need the world to say, we believe men can do it. And I do think there's been a poverty of imagination. No country in the world has a policy that says we believe men could do 50% of the care work. The Sustainable Development Goals have 5.4. Excuse me for quoting some buried language in the world's pact of what the planet should look like, but it doesn't say we think men can do half of this. It says redistribute a bit of it, doesn't give a number. So I think part of this is us having in our workplaces and policies and with our sons and daughters growing up that boys should be caregivers and providers, girls should be caregivers and providers. I'd like to see us get to that kind of collective imagination.
Grace, you want to talk a bit about that imagination and the shift that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because you do see momentum on the side of parental leave. We see Silicon Valley picking it up. But you're right. I mean, even in the companies that are most progressive in terms of the way they treat families, men, I've seen people, anecdotally, who will come up and say to me, I work for this multinational corporation, and I can't, even though paternity leave is offered and it's paid and it's 16 weeks, I can't take it because if I take it, I'll lose a competitive advantage within my cohort or my department. I think one thing that we haven't seen as much, but people are starting to talk about, is this impact of elder care, particularly the people who are in that sandwich generation. So maybe you have children at home, you've got aging parents, and for women, we know that the impact on the retirement's pretty severe. It's about $300,000 in foregone wages, lost retirement income, and so forth when women step out of the workforce to care for someone over 50, and they've taken time previous in their career to take care of kids. And I don't think I have to tell you, the folks in this room, but just imagine trying to re-enter the workforce as a woman in her late 50s or 60s who was at a high level in your career and coming back to that same career level when you still have maybe 10, 15, even 20 more years that you'd like to work. And I think that's a major challenge for a lot of families that we don't talk about, we don't celebrate. We celebrate the birth of a new child, we have cake at work and balloons, but we don't celebrate, and rightfully so, if someone has multiple sclerosis or my dad gets Parkinson's disease. But because we don't market, we don't provide support, and we don't create a culture of care that enables us to support those kinds of families.
Belinda, we were talking before we got on here that your company is creating that. And in fact, can you talk a little bit about some of the people that are championing this and sort of what's going on in your company in terms of that culture of care and the engagement?
So I have to say I fully agree with Gary on the statements, and this, and to a certain extent, this. I tend to believe that we need more emphasis on policy, right? Because to deal with the social barriers, which is what, in a way, what you are describing, that has been here for 30 years, right? Because we need policymakers to be much more determined, and we employers, private sector, not always like to be constrained by legislation, but to be honest, I think we need to have that as the frame to help us make certain decisions and again go faster. I can give you my own personal experience. My husband was the first man in Spain to ask to take paternity leave for 3 years. The law was published right before I was moving to one of my first assignments to Chicago, and he wasn't very popular in his hospital. He wasn't very popular, and his career was very significantly affected after that, probably forever, right? So, 30 years after this, I look at my own company and I don't see so much progress, right? We encourage, and I mentioned this before, we encourage people to take parental leave, but they hesitate because, again, they feel threatened by their own image and reputation. And so I believe that, again, I go back to the culture we want to create. I mean, we need to make this part of our management style, right? And on the caregiver side, through embracing carers, I already mentioned that on the introduction. We have now created an employee resource group, which is going to give us a better understanding of, okay, what are the needs of this population and how can we more actively support them. And it goes back to some of the basics that I mentioned before. So flexibility in the work environment, making sure that they are aware of the implication of caregiving, physical, emotional, so we care for carers, but for the caregiving space and giving them the chance to do better, but we also focus on the health of the carers in order to be able to anticipate the potential implications of this dedication. And I can tell you, caregiving is not of a specific culture or country. This is definitely universal. And we hopefully, through this embracing carers and through partnering with some of our key advisors, will find a way to make it much more prominent, to measure the implications in all fronts, and in doing so, hopefully identifying opportunities to progress on the policy side.
So Stacey, we see a need for policy. We're hearing it across. So give us an idea. Talk about what are some of the really good government policies, or what are some of the policies that you think are necessary that you see?
Yeah. So I think it has to start with access to good health care, and that is something that we think is sort of fundamental to making sure that women and families have the support they need to be healthy, to be productive in the workplace, that they have, again, the financial support to maintain their health so they can be good employees, they can be good parents, and that is something that obviously has been a big debate in this country. It's something that the March of Dimes, we've been very focused on preserving access to health care for all Americans, especially for women, especially for babies. I think the other thing that we think a lot about are the policies that then support women as they're having children and having babies. So we are always focused on making sure that there are the right accommodations for women in the workplace when they're pregnant. A lot of people don't think about the fact that pregnant women may have special needs, and they, depending on the type of work environment, they may have special accommodations that may need to be provided that aren't always provided. So making sure that there are policies in place that accommodate for the needs of pregnant women is really important. I think the other thing that we know is really critical is the focus on breastfeeding. So a lot of companies, again, have been leading on this more than our own government, but we want to make sure that women have access to the ability to safely and in a easy way make sure that they can pump at work, that they have places to safely and securely store milk at the workplace. They have to be able to breastfeed in order to make sure that their babies have the best access to the good health care that they need. And we all know the health benefits of breastfeeding for babies, and especially for babies that, again, are born premature. That's especially important. I think the other thing that we've been very focused on, and again, it's coming up this year, is the reauthorization of the Preemie Act. So one of the things that we are very focused on at the March of Dimes is we're very invested in science, very invested in medical research, both in the funding that we provide, but also the Preemie Act is a reauthorization of an act to make sure that there's sufficient federal funding for research around babies and making sure that premature baby research is continued at the federal level. And again, I think we're big supporters of family paid leave. I think these states that have gotten started in this, I think is a great start. But I think it's not sufficient for what we know families need. This issue of talking about childcare in this country is a little bit of, if you talk to any mother, and I have a couple of kids, and I know many of you all have kids too, I wouldn't say it's a joke because it's really not funny, but it's to say that we have a child care system it doesn't exist.
It does not.
Most of us in this country understand that when we have children and when we have babies, we are trying to put together some sort of network of some sort of child care provider, something that looks like our own personal system, including ourselves, to ensure that our babies and our children have the support that they need. That may be some combination of us, family members, maybe another parent or spouse, maybe it's extended family members, or we're trying to search on the internet for that trusted, child care provider that's gotten 5 stars from random people you don't know, but you're willing to go with that person as the person who's then going to take care of your kids when you're gone back to work. That to me is not a system, and it's also not affordable for a substantial number of women in this country. And again, if you've got a baby that's got special needs, a child that has, is really in need, and you've got to take extended care time, having to take time that's unpaid is often putting too much of a financial burden on you. So there are just a number of issues that we really need to sort of talk about. I do think that this country is way behind, and I think we all acknowledge that. I think there's a lot that we can learn from other countries in terms of what they're doing to support families. I think there are lots of great models that if we're willing to make the step, I think could actually improve productivity in this country, could actually improve family health and women's health and overall children's health. I think one of the things that's going to have to happen is we're going to need to think about and really make our voices heard with our policymakers. It is disturbing to me often when there are rooms full of men who then make decisions about the healthcare needs for us or me or women that look like me. And I think when we have more women in those rooms, we get a more diverse conversation, and I think we get better outcomes. I also think when you have more Bolins in the world, you get better outcomes in industry as well. I think when there are women running companies, you often find at the board level, and there's been research to show this, at the board level and at the CEO level, you find many of these policies being put in place that are more supportive of family and women and childcare and pregnancy and motherhood and working moms, and maybe as there are more women CEOs, maybe even the perception of men as childcare providers will even change. We'll even change the culture of that as well. So,
and definitely the more sort of women in government roles as well, understanding
Absolutely.
government services. Grace, I want to bring you in on sort of some of the best practices and some of the best policies that you see. We have access to healthcare, financial, sort of family leave. What do you think as well? Is there more? What else? What are you thinking in terms of this?
Well, there's been some research around it. Certainly, we did some in 2012, and then AARP with a group called the REACT Coalition put out a new report last year on best practices in corporate elder care. The thing I would say that is, I was watching that movie with Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, 9 to 5.
Oh, yeah.
The women sort of take over the workplace. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. But at the end of the movie, they've won, their struggle, and they're walking through the new and improved workplace. And Jane Fonda's saying, we have flex time and we've got child care on site, and look at all these improvements we made. And when I was watching this film, which is from the 80s, I thought to myself, very little has changed in the last 30 years because we're still putting forward a lot of these same policies. I mean, essentially, we're talking about flex time, telecommuting. To some degree, really progressive employers will have geriatric care managers, or they may have on-site elder care. There's a handful of companies that do emergency elder care time off. But I think in general, and to get at the point that Stacy was making, without buy-in and that culture of care within an environment, if you look at the data from the Society of Human Resource Management, people will not use elder care benefits without feeling comfortable to do so in the same way as parents. And I think the other thing is the policy change. We're big supporters of paid family leave. I mean, this is an issue whose time has come, and we think it's time to recognize, and you see both sides of the aisle, interest in finding a working paid family leave benefit that would be not only childcare but also caregiving across the lifespan.
Absolutely. Gary, talk a bit more about sort of what companies need to do, and what do you do if you're a small business?
I mean, I think the small businesses really illustrate how much we need policy. This can't be voluntary, just the businesses.
Absolutely.
I mean, just the corporations decide to offer it.
Yep.
And we know that everywhere that happens, it is typically the upper income workers who get it. Those who are further down the chain don't, and particularly those who are outsourced employees or hourly wage
Yep.
workers.
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with it as a 20-person organization with 2 people going on leave that we of course offer, even though we're not required to under FMLA.
Yep.
Because as you know, we don't have a system either for parental leave or childcare in this country. But as an organization that started in Brazil, where there's 4 months paid maternity leave, fully paid at 100% wage replacement, over 7 years we got it increased from 5 days for dads up to 20 days for dads. So that's still far better than here. Again,
Yep.
fully paid. So I think that, our story would be we can figure out a way to accommodate it, but that's a Band-Aid system. Really, we do need the policies in place to make that happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So wanted to talk a bit about, we've mentioned a couple of these initiatives, and I know that, Grace, you've done some research as well as to what tell us more about Embracing Cares. And then I'm going to turn to you, Stacy, about the new March of Dimes. Tell us more. What does Embracing Cares do? It's a platform, right?
Embracing Cares is a global initiative that is going to be further assessing the burden of people who dedicate time to caring for others overall. And so there is this dimension of research that we will conduct with our external partners. There is the internal dimension, which also help us diagnose what are the needs, how can we optimally address the needs. And we launched this employee resource group to provide assistance to colleagues that are also carers. So we are in the middle of it. We are starting to walk, and the idea would be that we take also a hard look at the way we can take this beyond the managerial topics, right? So flexible working environment is something that today we are not regulating equally in our different countries. We have a lot of diversity. Obviously, we comply with local regulations and all this, but we see this much more as an opportunity to engage our employees. And sooner or later, we will have to take a very hard look at our compensation and benefits, mainly the benefits portion of it, to see the way we support these specific populations. And this takes financial investment. We have to do it consistently across the company, so we require the board, to be very supportive of this as a team. Well, I am completely convinced that the high level of engagement that we have in our company today within healthcare in particular results from our interest in all these topics, right? So I think there is a lot to gain from this, and there we don't need to again spend too much time on the business case.
Yep.
We need to further understand the way we focus on this, because it's an investment that will be very well returned. So this is exactly what we are doing. So generating awareness, educating people, trying to look for the way we size the burden internally and externally, we believe this is a public health issue, and there is no consistent understanding of this. It's like very much kind of business as usual, and it has huge implications. So we are going to start looking at this as a company, right? Because I firmly believe that anything we promulgate, we have to also test in our own space, in our own company. So to the extent that is possible, we are going to go from here to a specific reviews of our benefit scheme.
Okay, that's wonderful.
In order to progress there.
So a lot of work. So you've got both sort of the advocacy piece, building off the research, but then you've got the actually action and doing.
Exactly.
Stacy, tell us a little bit about this Center for Social Science Research. Launched today, out in the news.
Right.
Tell us what's going on.
No, we're really excited about it. Today is the launch of it. We started this conversation with Belen and her team, I guess, several months ago. We both share this real interest in supporting healthy women, healthy mothers, looking at really, I think something Belen mentioned earlier, that the answer to some of these issues that we're talking about today around how do we really look at how to create more productive women and mothers in the workplace is really around looking at policies and how do we identify which policies and create a more supportive policy environment that will promote the ability for women to be able to work, continue to work, continue to have families, grow, and be supported in that, and ensure that they are healthy and that their families are healthy. So we, with the support of EMD Serono, are launching the Center for Social Science Research. It is designed to really do a series of focused research papers to sort of identify and analyze which policies will be best to promote women's productivity in the workplace and motherhood, so working moms and childbirth, and really looking at the issues of equity as well. And so we're very, very excited about it. This I think it speaks to the core of where both of our missions as organizations intersect. And for sure, it will give us a platform to be able to talk to both companies and also to policymakers about things that we can do as a society to make sure that more women, especially women that choose to work and also our caregivers, have the support that they need. We also are going to be looking at ways in which we can revise some of the maternal wellness programs that we have in place, and some of the partnership is going to support that as well. We've been a strong partner with many companies over many years to actually promote and provide information to many women in the workplace, so that they have all the information they need to have a healthy pregnancy, have a healthy baby. So we're going to continue to provide that and make sure that it's more available in the hands of those employees and those women throughout the course of their pregnancy. So we're very excited about the partnership, and this center I think is going to be very impactful and going to make a big difference for many working mothers and many babies as well.
No, it sounds great, and sort of bringing all of that together.
Yeah.
I think the research, the policy, and sort of the best practices, if you will.
Absolutely.
It's incredibly important. Grace, I want to talk a bit about your platform, and you've done some surveys, you've done some research. What are you guys working on right now?
So I would say paid leave is one of our biggest priorities. Another thing I would say is 1/3 of our work really is working on international initiatives related to caregiving, and we're the Secretariat of the International Alliance for Care Organizations, and of course work very closely with EMD Serono and other companies and nonprofits around the world that care about this issue. So we have about 15 countries engaged on this, and then some of those groups are also involved with the Embracing Carers movement. And I think that word movement, that's really important, right? Because the world is aging. And if we look at mid-century, we have in most of the world, 1 out of 5 people will be over 60. And we also have family sizes that are shrinking. So the availability of people to provide care is shrinking. And that's an issue that we can't really tackle just as the United States. We have to look to what's being done in other countries. And we know, for example, in the UK, Carers UK and other caregiving groups in that country have worked to actually enshrine in the law the right to request a flexible work environment, the right to emergency time off, and protection against discrimination. And there's not as much protection in other countries, but I will say in the U.S. The Congress just passed and was signed into law the Raise Family Caregivers Act. It'll create a national strategy for family caregiving across the lifespan, across disease states, and the president signed it into law in January, and within a year and a half, they're required by law to put out a strategy for caregiving, much like you see in other nations. So I'm hopeful that that policy work, not only will we learn from what works in other places, but we'll start to gain momentum on some of these other family issues that have been neglected.
Absolutely. Gary, I want to sort of bring it back up to the international. You've got sort of an international network of organizations, and you work a lot with the UN, and you also brought up sort of this advocacy piece of it. Perhaps sort of a two-pronged question on sort of, what are you guys doing internationally, and also, what are these conversations at the UN? How can we improve the advocacy, or what role does that play?
Yeah. There are 45 countries that are now part of the Men Care campaign, which has been around since 2011, trying to get countries and also the UN to say, what do we need to have in place at the policy level and also the social norm level in terms of changing to getting toward a world where caregiving is equally divided. And I think the challenge has been, how do we put this into detail? So one, at the global advocacy level, we put out 2015, the first ever State of the World's Fathers report, and we did a new one in 2017. One challenge there has been that we don't collect standardized data on how much men participate in caregiving. We've got good time use studies. We did an analysis of 100 of those for the 2017 report, but we don't put into national statistics gathering how much men do of the caregiving. We have a huge amount of data here and in parts of Western Europe, but having, if you don't count it, it doesn't really count. And if you don't have some numbers that you can look toward to say, are we pushing men along? The other is to try to figure out where to start on this. And so I think the other policy lever that we're taking is at the country level with partner NGOs saying, let's work with our ministries of women's policy, ministries of health to say, where are some ways that we can get men in the door, and how could you change some policy levers to do so? The health sector's been one of those. About 80% of men go to at least one prenatal visit. Most of the time we don't do anything with them when they go there. So part of it is simply kind of introducing
But they're there,
healthcare
right?
workers
That's
to,
good.
healthcare worker man, call him by his name, give him a place. Screen for violence,
Seriously.
of course. This is not we have to acknowledge when that happens and when it exists, so it's got to be a do no harm as well. But one is sort of using that as a port of entry and getting that part of the policy array. The other is poverty alleviation stuff. Lots of countries are using successfully cash transfer programs and income support programs. Most of that money going to mothers and saying, how can we resend a message that we don't really expect fathers to do much or to be around? Our country has a tragic history of telling men of color, we don't think you can do much of anything as in the household level. So, how do we get countries to change their poverty alleviation policies? And third, and I'll end on that, is to start young. We know from our global data, we carry out a survey called the International Men and Gender Equality Survey that we've now done in nearly 40 countries. We know that men who see their fathers do caregiving are more likely to do it. And we know that boys who are made to do this growing up, the chores, the caring for a younger sibling, are 1.5 to 2 times more likely to do it as adults. So if we don't build this in from even earlier on, we've got a huge issue.
Start in your
So
house.
it's, the culture of care language, we're very much about kind of how do we get a male or a masculine ethic of care going on as well, both men's own health, how do we teach this early on, and how do we instrumentalize it and make it possible? And then last, of course, is around parental leave. So a lot of dialogue with countries on how do we promote parental leave that gets men to take their share of it as well.
Their share. Now, before I turn it to the audience, I want to kind of ask, because Belen, you touched on it, and it's sort of where I sit in my job, right? How important is the role of women's leadership? Right, so it's an interesting. We've got a panel here that is majority women, and I don't want that to be just because we're talking about a women's issue. And I think part of what I hope you're getting is that we're talking about this is a family issue. This is everybody's types of decisions. But in looking at some of these policies, and I'd love sort of a comment from everybody. How important is it? There's women leaders in the company or women leaders in the government. How important is that?
I think this helps, right? But it's not enough. I think we have to, I wish that each and every company understands that diversity and inclusion leads to better performance, right? So it is foolish not to address this. And to be honest, it's very frustrating when when people start looking at, okay, what is the business case? Well, why the business case? There is no business case, you know? You cannot leave 50% of the population behind, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is, you know, I think it, well, unfortunately, is a, you know, having women in leadership helps.
But it's not the end all.
Having women in senior political position helps, but we shouldn't just delegate on that or hope that this is the only way we are going to progress, because unfortunately we are still very few.
That's-
You know, and we don't want to get into this vicious circle in which we say, okay, we count that this. No, I mean, this is a leadership topic, you know, and diversity and inclusion, and this is the way I present this in my own company, is the consequence of great leadership. So great leaders strive for diversity and for inclusion, and this is where everything starts. So you have to make this part of your competitive advantage.
Absolutely.
And, well, those leaders who understand that this is the case and that this is going to give you a huge competitive advantage should go for it, regardless of the gender of the CEO.
And whether you're a man or a woman. Stacey, I'd love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Belen. I think it's very important. It's maybe not sufficient for what we're talking about. We are talking about changing the culture of how we think about the roles of men and women, how we treat women and families, how we support them in the workplace, and that requires everyone's involvement, and it requires everyone to have a different frame of mind. I don't give short shrift, though, to women in leadership positions. I believe it's important, and I believe we don't have enough of them. And I do believe it can be very, very important. Belen is one of very few women in her industry at the top. There are few, if any, women of color now leading for a Fortune 100 company. I can't say what impact that has on those companies with respect to their promotion of diversity and inclusion. There are tons of companies that have great programs around diversity and inclusion and have great leaders who really prioritize it, for sure. But I do know that it changes, culture is about tone at the top. And when you've got a leader who steps into a role with coming from a different life experience, a different perspective, sharing a different kind of set of ideas that may be different from what others have been accustomed to hearing or learning about, it can make a big difference to sort of broaden the way that everyone in that organization thinks about the world and thinks about a set of issues. It's a very influential thing. And so, and plus, I think if we want to make sure that everyone participates in the economy, we need to make sure that there are pathways for people to do that. So I think leadership matters, and it is everything. It makes a big difference, and we need whoever the leader is to look at these policies and embrace these kinds of ways of thinking in new ways and understand where the world is today. You know, we have many organizations that are still reflecting too much of the way things have been, as opposed to leading us into where we are today and the future where we're going and should be going. So we need those kinds of leaders that are thinking ahead and helping us to get there.
To get there.
You know, maybe I'll push the conversation back to the state. We still believe that the state can do things. The world of, you know, Fortune 500 CEOs is a rarefied air, and while it is important, I'd like to see equality in our parliaments and congresses in every level of decision making, from city councils and school boards and all the rest, because we do believe there's really important decisions that are being made there. And it does matter that we achieve something closer to 50-50, and now we're at best global average around 20%.
Exactly.
If last, probably 19, I think was the last number that I saw. So I think, and I think we also need to see men at all levels, not just Mark Zuckerberg taking his paternity leave, but at all levels of management and the corporate world and the workplace saying, I take leave, I support my workers who do it, you see me doing it, you see me take time off. And I think we also see a transformation that starts to happen there. There's some data from Scandinavian countries suggesting that as men do more of the hands-on caregiving, we vote more like women which means to say that's not a weakness, that is a good thing for the world, which means that we vote for childcare, we vote for better welfare policies that acknowledge all of us, we believe in gender equality, we tend to care about, do our daughters do well in the world as well as do our sons do well? So I think there's a shift that happens culturally there as well when we get men to do more of that. So I think that's got to be kind of part of our imagination as well, to say we need to get the leadership of women, but we also need men at all levels saying this is part of who I am and what I do, and making it the norm, not will he take his leave.
Exactly.
So that someday we won't go, oh, isn't that great that Mark Zuckerberg or any of us did this, that this becomes normal. Because that's another place, that a man does a little bit of this and we call it helping, doing his share. Even the way we speak of it, or that we celebrate him, that he just did, the things that we should be doing anyway.
Exactly.
The number of times I get, oh, look, you brought your daughter to this. It's like, yeah, what else should I be doing? So I think that normalcy, making that completely normal is still, we're a long way off. So that your husband, and I did some of this as well, we don't have to feel like these ETs.
Oh, he's a saint. He's a saint.
No, I don't.
He's a saint. He's been sainted.
It never ends well for saints. I don't think that's a good thing that we want.
Now we're dabbling into religion. So.
Joking about this.
No, but I think that notion
to basically
Right.
endorse your normalities,
Yeah.
right? Because, I can tell you, I would speak to 50 people, and this would be considered like, wow, right?
Yeah.
So when, hopefully we dream that one day this will be absolutely normal, right?
Yeah.
So I think this notion, I really love this notion of the normality,
Making it normal.
that making it normal, right? And I think we are very far away from having achieved that
Absolutely.
objective.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think it's important to acknowledge that men and women care differently. They do different types of activities. I saw a really interesting presentation at the NIH about parents who are caring for children with terminal illness and how they manage the grief of the illness while they're still caring for that child, and what was most important to both parents. And for women, it was most important that the child knew they were well loved, and for men, it was most important that they understood the disease. But then when it was a single parent household with a single mom, it was most important that they understood the disease. So I think the other piece here is to remember that families are non-traditional, right? We don't live in a world of atomic families. So if you think about who do you care for, who's your best friend that you might care for through the end of their life, even though you have no legal relationship, you have no blood relation to them. This idea that, we have gender roles to some degree is true and bears out in research, but to some degree we have to allow for non-traditional styles of leadership. We have to allow for even not being so binary about gender and thinking about LGBT communities
Absolutely.
and how those families look. And I think we're having those conversations, and I think women in leadership is important. There's a baseline equity we have to get to, right? To the point about pathways. There's a baseline where we have to get to. But once we get to some of those places where we see a little bit of that equity, I think we need to remember there's not one size that fits all. It's more about the person at the top understanding the value of diversity and inclusion, and again, setting that tone for the rest of the people under their leadership.
Absolutely. No, that's a great sort of way to bring it back to the diversity, inclusion, understanding where we are. We have a lot of rich information here on not only what sort of each of these people have done, but this whole burden of care from the leadership down to sort of who's experiencing it. So I want to turn it over to the audience for some questions. We have about 20 minutes. There are microphones. What I would like to encourage you to do is please introduce yourself and say where you come from. But please restrain your interventions to a question, which usually means, an inflection in your voice, and usually is less than 6 lines long. But in true Wilson Center capacity, we want to engage you, the audience, and get some of your thoughts. I think I see a hand up in the back row there.
Thank you very much. My name is Nikki Droney, and I am a fellow at George Mason University. And my research has actually been focusing on parental leave and the effects on gender equality. It's been very clear to me that the research has proven that gender equitable family policies like parental leave make for a healthier society and healthier families. How do we bridge that gap with the naysayers and those who are simply just stuck in our old patriarchal formats?
I see people. Gary, that feels like a Gary answer to me.
we go back to those rarefied countries near the Arctic Circle in Scandinavia where they've been experimenting with this for 20 years. And the data shows very clearly where they've achieved something closer to gender equality, they have lower family violence rates, they have lower homicide rates, and they do find a correlation with that. They find a close association between a gender equality and quality of life and life happiness. And none of those countries seems to have sunk economically speaking. And even Iceland, when it was facing one of its worst economic crises, decided to expand parental leave, not decrease it. So I think we've got, some 4 or 5 good experiments that we should be able to show those who would say somehow this is going to, turn us into a world of emasculated men, or somehow this is going to make us weaker economically or in other ways. I think the data says, whether it's well-being for women, whether it's well-being for children, whether it's well-being for men, because we also live longer, we're happier, less likely to be arrested, less likely to abuse substances, and I can make a list that goes about 10 more items when we do more hands-on caregiving. The data is pretty overwhelming, but I think, and Grace, you said this well, it's really a challenge to break the gender binary that we could see men doing half of it, but where it happens, lots of things get better. So yes, keep saying it. We need more people saying it. Keep repeating it. And then I think, more leaders. Our previous head of state, his first visit to the White House, wanted to know what the bedrooms look like so he could describe that to his daughters. How important that is to have a leader who does that. Compare that to a current commander-in-chief who has said other things about caregiving. So leadership, policy, repeating it, showing the benefits.
And I think in another area where we work as well, there's a fair amount of data, especially coming out of Valerie Hudson's work at Texas A&M, that societies are more peaceful when there's less violence, in the home and in the communities, and less violence against women. Peace treaties last longer, but communities are more sort of stable and peaceful. So I think sort of pulling on some of that other research from other areas to help break through the, in the end, you want, productive and healthy communities, that everyone has an earning potential. Other questions? The woman right here.
Hi, I'm Genevieve Smith from the International Center for Research on Women. And one note that you mentioned, Gary, I thought was really interesting, and it was around how smaller companies can't necessarily be expected to provide a lot of these other types of things that larger companies can provide. So in terms of best practices for companies to implement related to reducing and redistributing unpaid care, what is kind of the boundary or level between, best practice for a large company versus smaller company, and in locations in governments where they might not support other types of care, what are kind of the next steps to create a more enabling environment in those locations?
And I don't think I'm the only one to comment on this one. I'm happy to, but also if one of you wants.
Yeah.
I'll let you go.
Again, I think if this is up to a single employer to decide if we do it, it is a burden for a 10-person, a 5-person, a 20-person workplace to say we're going to have a worker gone for 3 to 4 months. That is a burden that we've got to think about collectively to say, how are we going to do this? I think what we've done is try to work on, as a small employer, to say we're going to work together to make sure that person feels they can take leave and focus on that and come back, and nobody's angry or resentful of that time that they took off. But that's even easier to do if we're all paying into a social insurance program or paying a portion of payroll taxes. That means that that's covered and paid for elsewise, that we know that everybody is getting that equally. That's when it becomes a lot easier. I don't think we want to let small employers off the hook by saying we can't do this. But I do think it requires us saying, I'm not giving it to you as a kind of individual right or a benefit that you get, but saying collectively, and that's what we've worked toward, to try to say collectively we value this. I want it sometime as well, so all of us have to offer. So I think it's building toward the collective. It's a lot easier to do that, however, if all of us have that, and it's a transferable one that if you leave if you leave work for us in a year, you take it with you to your next employer. So I think there's nothing getting around that we have to have those hard conversations about the policy, at statutory policy.
Yeah, and if I can jump in there, I think, so we're an organization of 5 people. Many nonprofit and advocacy groups in Washington are small organizations, and we've had that same discussion about how, we're a caregiving organization. we have to be able to offer caregiving benefit, right? But there are realities to that. And I think to the point that you're making, you know, when we look at some of our colleagues in parts of Europe where they offer more flexible work environments, the reason they're able to do so is because they have a social insurance structure and they have health care as a benefit, so that two of the major concerns about continuing at work are handled and the employer doesn't have to shoulder the burden. When you look at Congress and the debates that they're having about the Family Act, which is probably the most extensive paid leave bill, versus the 21st Century Family Workforce bill that's on the Republican side, and even Senator Marco Rubio's bill, you see that debate playing out about this question of who pays. And the reason we're debating who pays is because we're still debating whether health care is even a fundamental right.
Yeah.
And so until we hit some of those barriers, it's, I think, a difficult case to make that the employer has to shoulder 100% of the cost.
It goes back to Stacey's point, too, about sort of the lack of a child care system. And if you're in various countries in Europe and you have health care, but you also have a free child care, you know, or you have a system set up. And then you also, I lived in Holland. You had a system where when you moved in Holland, you got 2 paid days of leave to actually physically move your apartment. You know, these are social structures that enable you and enable the employer to create an environment where people are healthy and can engage.
Right.
Any other questions? It's looking like a very quiet audience. I think there's a question in the middle here in the back.
Hi, I'm Toby Klinger, and I teach psychology and global women's studies at a community college in Kansas City. And my question's for Stacey. Congratulations on this social science research that you're going to be working together with. And I want to go back to, I'm going back from a macro level to a micro level, but kind of combining them, about nursing and the importance of breastfeeding. Do you know if there are plans in the research to look at why, and particularly African American women, are less likely to breastfeed, and what's the implications on creating more change?
Yeah. Well, we're still in the process of identifying some of those areas of the research, and we certainly know. And you're raising a point that is something that is quite a concern. One of the things, it's interesting because I've been having recent conversations with the dean of the Morehouse School of Medicine recently about the fact that so many of babies in safety net hospitals, for example, have less access to donor breast milk, and that is obviously if they're preemie in these hospitals, not having access to donor breast milk is a complicating factor for them being able to really thrive and ultimately build up their strength to move on from the hospital. And it's a real issue, especially for African American communities. And it also reflects as well on this bigger issue that we've been struggling with in the African American community about some of the barriers that are even cultural around how the African American community sees breastfeeding. We certainly can take that into account in terms of the research. We're looking again at those issues and all the issues that, you know, actually stand in the way of women's health and babies' health, but also then intersect with policies in the workplace as well. So I guess it'd be interesting to see whether or not there's anything in the workplace that could be done to actually speak to African American women in the workplace, to encourage them to consider breastfeeding and really promote breastfeeding that are more culturally specific. And that's certainly something that we want to continue to do at the March of Dimes, whether it's inside the workplace or out. But it certainly is an issue that we have to focus on. We continue to promote breastfeeding for all women and all babies because we know that it is the healthiest alternative for any baby, whether they're born premature or born a full term. So thanks for that.
Part of that education piece we were talking about earlier in workplace policies, but also just sort of health policies generally.
Right. And also just the importance of being more culturally aware. And it's something that at the March of Dimes, in addition to all this great work that we're doing with this new center, you know, a primary focus for us that touches everything that we do is around health equity. and dealing with health disparities. We feel as though we can't deal with these issues, the issue of premature birth or infant mortality. Now this issue of maternal mortality, which is in this country an enormous challenge where, we're of the wealthiest countries in the world. We see our rates really increasing where other wealthy countries are seeing their rates decreasing. And we've got to be able to address those issues in ways that address the differences across communities, right? Because it's not happening at the same levels and in the same ways evenly. And so understanding all of these disparities and understanding how to engage and connect with communities in different ways is something that is embedded in our focus on health equity. And it's interesting because the March of Dimes, if people think about the March of Dimes in our history, we may not have always been perceived as a leader in health equity, but we believe that that has got to change if we're going to see any meaningful progress with respect to improving the health of all moms and all babies. We've got to be able to stand for the engagement of all of them and speak to the disparities and really create the partnerships that make a difference. So the area of breastfeeding is something that's really important, so we want to make sure that it's a central focus of ours.
I see a question over here.
Thank you. This is for Stacy. Good morning, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here. You mentioned the child care system, and I think back to when I turned over my child into the child care system and spent about 10 days camped out at his child care facility before they told me to leave. It's very difficult to turn over your child to the care of somebody else.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate because I'm a military officer and I have access to care on the installation where I serve. Mm-hmm. What kind of programs or education are you looking at as you spoke of this child care system concept to help other people be able to find that quality child care and have trust in the people they are turning their children over to?
Yeah. Well, a lot of our focus is really on pregnancy and newborns, especially, I would say, up to the age of 1 in particular, just because infant mortality is a big area of focus. But as we get into some of these issues of what do we need to support healthy moms and healthy babies, especially with this new center, I think it's worthwhile for us to really understand and look more deeply into child care system. We certainly have looked at policies that we know are really important. We've talked about things like paid family leave, so at least families have more support and they have more financial support to make sure that they have the ability to care for a child, especially if their child, as I mentioned earlier, has some special needs or is born, with special health needs for sure. But I also think that what's really important is, and we look at, again, these issues of if a child has continuing issues over time, we have to think about the fact that there's a child care system that also has to accommodate special needs. I was just following one of the families that we've been particularly close to. We have a program that is offered in neonatal intensive care units to support families who find themselves in a NICU. They weren't expecting to have a baby born too soon. It happens suddenly, and all of a sudden they don't know what to do and where to turn, and we provide support to those families so that they have access to resources and their questions are answered around what next for me and my baby. And this child, this baby was born at 26 weeks. She was born at a little under 2 pounds. And her mother does this amazing blog of the story of this child. And it's heartbreaking how this baby, not baby now, she's like, almost a couple of years old, but she's going to occupational therapy multiple times a week. She's got vision problems. She's got hearing problems. She is a happy little child, but it is so clear to me that she is happy and doing as well as she possibly can be because she has an amazing mother and father, I would say. Her mother's the one doing the blog and telling the story. And it struck me yesterday when I was reading some of her story. I have no idea what's underneath the support system that she has to have. It has got to be incredibly complex and complicated and expensive. And I'm sure she's got a very supportive family. But how does another family like that cobble together a system and pay for it for years on end?
Yeah.
And as a country, are we just deciding that we're just going to ignore those children when 1 out of 10 children is born premature. And so a substantial number of children are born every year with those issues, and families are then having to bear those issues, and we just don't think about what is required. So those are definitely some of the things we need to really assess and understand in this work and decide what are the policies that are really important. And I think we really need to have strong partners, because we can't do it alone, that come together and sort of advocate together and have a strong voice around it.
This seems actually like a great place to end, in the sense of, we talked a lot today about, in the burden of care space and beyond, I would say, of the importance of policies, right? The importance of culture change being also, as Belen mentioned, sort of what you do in your company, what your company does outside, and as Gary talked about, what you do in your household. Where does it start, and what do you do every day to do something? We also talked a lot about diversity and inclusion, looking at what the different pieces and the different groups look like. Not everybody looks the same. Not everybody looks the same global. Probably not every Scandinavian country looks the same. They look pretty similar. And we also talked about the role of strong leadership, the role of women, but just leaders who understand this and who make diversity and inclusion, a priority, which is not easy. It's not easy to make that a priority. And I wanted to end on this research piece and the couple points that people brought up about really trying to understand where we are today and what this looks like today, right? Sort of the challenging the assumptions, the diving deep and seeing what are the realities that people are facing, this notion of equity, and really, I think, understanding where we are. And what I think is so nice about this panel is that everybody on this panel is working together and understanding the importance of partnerships and alliances. So I would like to thank all of you today, and Belen for the keynote. We are honored to have you at the Wilson Center, and thank you so much. And please give them a warm round of applause.